Hello YouTube, Dave here again. It's time for another installment of my series of videos where I go through and sort of catalog or archive my various D&D collections. Today I'm going to be taking a look at D&D 3rd edition, and by 3rd edition I mean D&D 3.0, which ran from the summer of 2000 until about the summer of 2003. I will be doing a separate video for D&D 3.5. Before I start that, however, there were a couple of products that I missed when I was doing my 2nd edition AD&D video, and I didn't realize it until I started adding the items into my the list I'm tracking on my personal Facebook page before I get everything sort of combined and put together and posted on my the channel's Facebook page, I should say. So I just wanted to go through really quickly and have those two things added just for the purpose of showing that I have them. So the first is a 2nd edition. They're both adventures, but this is the Vortex of Madness. Yeah, let's just do that. So this was a high-level adventure for 2nd edition AD&D, but the cool thing about it is that it was written by Chris Pramus, who's the same person who went on to do the rule set for the Dragon Age role-playing game, which is a system that I really, really love. So it's kind of cool to have something that he did for, you know, TSR or Dungeons & Dragons. I guess it was probably Wizards of the Coast by the time this came out. Yeah, it was Wizards of the Coast. But still pretty cool to have something that he did for D&D before, you know, decade or so later moving on to the Dragon Age RPG. So that's pretty cool. And then the last one for 2nd edition AD&D that I forgot was the Silver Anniversary version of Return to White Plume Mountain. So this is sort of like an update or would be sequel to the original White Plume Mountain adventure set in the AD&D rule set. So really cool to have that as well. Set in the world of Greyhawk. They also did these for, I think it was like Tomb of Horrors, and I think Keep on the Borderland, Return to Keep on the Borderland was actually another one of these Silver Anniversary things that came out, if I recall. I'm not 100% on that one though, so don't quote me. But anyway, I just wanted to sort of you know, clean that up from my 2nd edition AD&D video, just a few things that I missed. So let's go ahead and go right into the 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons. Like I said, 3.0 as it's now referred to, released in the summer of 2000. And the first thing I'm going to show here is sort of their starter set. So this is the Dungeons & Dragons adventure game. This is for, again, for 3rd edition. And what was interesting about 3rd edition is prior to its release, there were the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons line, and then there was the Rule Cyclopedia, which just had the title of Dungeons & Dragons. And with 3rd edition, they dropped the word advanced. They got rid of the Rule Cyclopedia style or the D&D basic, but because they didn't have a basic version anymore, there was no need to have the advanced version, so they just went with the D&D name. That said, 3rd edition sort of has a lot in common with the D&D basic rules, in that you have your ability scores give you a straight modifier instead of having their own separate charts for, you know, each of the different things. They also got rid of stuff like exceptional strength for fighters having an 18 strength. That's all gone now, and you know, any character could have any strength. So they kind of changed a lot of the things about that. They also got rid of things like level caps for the classes, and for the most part level restrictions, or not level restrictions, racial restrictions on the classes that you can play. I think with a couple of exceptions. I think paladins still had to be human, if I recall correctly. But anyway, this adventure game has 6 small adventures included in it. It came with a fold-out map with a bunch of just, you know, flat tokens. And overall, it is a pretty cool adventure. I did run several of the adventures contained within on a couple of live streams. Unfortunately, just a lot of things kind of got in the way of me continuing that series, which is unfortunate because I think we were down to just the last large adventure at the end. But this is just a really, really cool set, and this was also the first ever Dungeons & Dragons box set that I ever purchased with my own money. So just kind of cool to have that there. So that's the first one. And then of course we have our core rule books. So the first one here is obviously the Player's Handbook. This is my original copy that I got way back in the summer of 2000. It was probably less than a month after 3rd edition came out. I was still running 2nd edition for probably almost until the end of that year. Before I finally fully switched over. I think it was around the winter holidays when I got the other 2 core books. But this was, like I said, this was my original. You know, it saw a fair bit of use, and unfortunately it's got like a scratch and stuff on it, but you know, I loved this book at the time. I do have the character generator CD in here, although I ended up getting that out of a second copy because I gave away my initial copy because I didn't have a computer at the time. That's sort of how long ago this was. It was still in an age where not necessarily everyone was guaranteed to have a computer, or more like today's day and age where computers tend to outnumber members of the family. But what was cool about the original Player's Handbook is it came out before the other 2 core books. So in the back of the book, they had sort of a miniature, like it's called the 2000 Survival Kit. And it has like a miniature Dungeon Master's Guide and Monster Manual so that you could make your own adventures while you wait for the other books to come out, which came out in like, let's see, September and October. So I think it was in August when the Player's Handbook came out. It was either July or August anyway. So it was really cool to have these. There were later printings of the Player's Handbook that didn't need that anymore because obviously the 2 books had come out. So in its place they actually had some like Q&A stuff from Dragon Magazine, from the Sage Advice column, just trying to clear up some of the major questions about how some of the rules worked. So that was in the later printings. I don't have a copy of that version of the Player's Handbook. It's not necessarily really on my list of things that I want to get. If I can find one, then great, but I'm not too worried about it. I also have a second copy here of the Player's Handbook, and that was just basically I had the opportunity to pick it up. This one had the CD still inside, and I had like 2 copies of the Player's Handbook for pretty much every other edition, so I thought it would just be, you know, fitting to have a second copy of the 3.0 Player's Handbook if I ever do end up running it, which I probably won't. But if I do, then I have an extra Player's Handbook to go around. Alright, up next we have, of course, the Dungeon Master's Guide. And I really like these covers, actually. Like I thought the design of them was really, really cool. That they just looked like, you know, like ancient tomes and stuff like that with like elaborate, like this one has like a locking mechanism on it. The Player's Handbook has like, it's all jeweled out. And I don't know how well it's going to show here. You can kind of see it in the red crystal, but there's actually an image. So the way that they did these covers is they actually created a physical item, and the red gem shows it the best, but I don't know how well it's going to come across on camera. But in the red jewel, you can see a reflection of like the camera that's taking the picture of the product. So I just thought that was kind of neat. And here we got our DMG. And then finally we have our core rulebook 3, which is the Monster Manual. So again, pretty standard series of core rulebooks, and yeah, nothing too unique about this in terms of, you know, it's just pretty much your standard array of monsters. There was always some cool artwork and stuff in there. This book also got a lot of use back in the day. So we have the original Monster Manual, but there was more than one monster book for 3.0. So we also have the Monster Manual 2 for second edition, for 3rd edition D&D, and really have mixed feelings about this book. I mean, the cover looks awesome. Like, you know, it's just a really, really sweet looking book. But I picked this up actually right before I really spent a lot of time at you know, the local game store in the area where I lived. I'd gone there like once or twice, but I didn't know anyone really there yet, and I was always like really introverted, so I wasn't really good at talking to people. I did get better as time went on, but at this point I was still willing to get my books anywhere that I could find them. So I actually got this from Kohl's, which is a version of Chapters bookstore that's just confined to like malls. And you know, I picked this up and I didn't realize until I actually got out of the store and got home but this one was damaged, and this was damage that came right, originally with the book. So this was always like that. And basically, I think what happened is they were trying to cut the box open and they nicked it or something. But when I was thinking about it, it was always kind of weird because the person held it in a really weird, like he had his hand over the cover, and he was covering over that damage. And I remember that, like, he tilted it away from me to put it in the bag. And basically, I guess he just didn't want me to see the damage, because if I noticed, I probably would have asked about them knocking some of the price off, or I would have put it back and grabbed another copy. So it was kind of dirty that they did that, but it is what it is. It's, I guess, the difference between a bookstore and a dedicated game store. And this was actually, this was really even before I was really as eccentric, I guess you could say, about how my books were handled. But I remember that this incident, getting this book like this, was the thing that basically drove me away from buying stuff at the bookstore and to, only getting my books from my actual local game store until the time that they went out of business. So that was that moment there. But also, like, yeah, I guess the other thing, just before we wrap up here, the monsters in here just weren't super great. There weren't a lot of things that I wanted to use in my campaign. The coolest things that were in here were basically some of the creatures from the chainmail tabletop game. Like, we had the Abyssal Skulker, the Abyssal Skulker, the Abyssal Ravager, and the Abyssal Maw. And you had like some of the Fell Drakes, stuff like that. But that was pretty much it. And otherwise, like, I never actually used anything out of this book, so not the greatest one there. But the next monster-related book for 3rd edition was a lot better, and that is the Fiend Folio. And again, just a really, really fantastic cover. Just a really nice-looking book, and a pretty cool collection of monsters. Also some interesting templates in here. This is where you had like the half Elithid, so like the half Mind Flare type creature, and there were some other things in here as well. But just, again, a pretty decent book overall. Just trying to see if I can find, I'm not going to worry about it right now, but this one, if you were looking to get 3rd edition, like 3.0 monster books, I would say get the original Monster Manual and get this. But it would be okay to skip over the Monster Manual too, because it just wasn't that great a book, unfortunately, at least in my opinion. But the Fiend Folio was a lot better. So let's just sort of move these out of the way here. Alright, up next we have, this is my only module that's not connected to a specific campaign setting that I have for 3rd edition, but this is Heart of Nightfang's Spire. And when 3.0 first came out, there were a series of adventures. I think there were like 10 modules altogether. And they were designed, I guess, to be sort of standalone, but you could run them as a campaign because the levels lined up to take you all the way from level 1 to level 20. So things like the Sunless Citadel and the Forge of Fury that have been recently reprinted in 5th edition in Tales from the Yawning Portal, they were the first 2 chapters of like this installment. And the biggest thing about 3rd edition is it wanted to get away from like adventures and modules, and it focused more primarily on like hardcore, or not hardcore, hardcover or paperback supplements, and not so much on like the adventures and modules that had always sort of been like the bread and butter of like the AD&D era and the Rule Cyclopedia Basic D&D era. So they kind of got away from that. This adventure was actually written by Bruce Cordell, who is one of my favorite authors. I never actually really got around to reading this. I actually picked this up. It was bundled with the Pool of Radiance for the Forgotten Realms that I got from a store, but I do want to go through and read this just because, like I said, he was one of my favorite authors for 3rd edition back in the day, so pretty cool to have that. Would like to go back and get the series if possible, but it's not one of those things that feels like it's a missing hole in my collection, so, not a big pressure to get them, but it is kind of cool to at least have one of them. Up next, one of my favorite books and one of my most used ones for 3rd edition. This is the Hero Builder's Guidebook. So this was a book geared towards beginners or people, getting into 3rd edition for the first time. Came out around the same time as the 3rd edition rule set. And, it's got information on basically, the races, the classes, stuff like that, some of the rules that you have. But the biggest thing about this is the back of the book is what I ended up using the most. And it's just the last few pages. But the last few pages are just filled with names for humans, dwarves, elves, gnomes, half-orcs, halflings, and orcs. And I use this, I'm terrible with names, so even to this day I will pull this off the shelf every once in a while and pull names out of it. So really, really useful book. Not so much for the information contained within about how to create your characters, but for that list of names alone, one of my favorite and most used supplements of all time. So going from my most used to my least used, in that I've never used it, but I do have a copy of the Stronghold Builder's Guidebook as well. So this is one of those things that the book is actually kind of interesting. It makes for an interesting read, but it's something that I never wanted to implement in my games. I mean, I could consider doing it like nowadays just for the basic information about building the strongholds, but essentially my local game store had 3 copies, I think, that had been on the shelf for months and months, and just nobody was really biting on it. So finally one day, I think the owner actually gave me a deal on it, and I picked up another book as well that I ended up giving to a buddy of mine. But I ended up getting this for, I think it was like $35 was the original price. That was like taxes in and everything. And I think I got it for, I want to say 20. So I got a deal on it, and like I said, it's an interesting read. Never used it, probably never will, but it's still just one of those things that, to me, that was just kind of a cool way to end up getting this. Was actually getting a nice deal on it, so that's why I've got that in the collection. So up next, we got some more hardcovers here. So 3rd edition was sort of hit or miss with their hardcover books. And even really with a lot of their softcover books as well, there were just, they were either really good or they were kind of bad. But this first one here was actually really great. So this is the Arms and Equipment Guide. This is just filled with like new weapons, new armor types. You have like information on vehicles such as like carts, wagons, boats, ships, stuff like that. Types of combat involving like naval combat or things along those lines. And some really, really cool stuff in here. And there's also artifacts. So you have stuff like the Rod of 7 Parts is in here, and a few other of the classic artifacts. So this was a really, really great book. And if you were looking to sort of outfit some of your NPCs with stuff that just didn't feel so mundane, then this was a great book. So let's just see if I can quickly find my way. And this was also sort of unique because it was, I think, the only hardcover book for 3rd edition that was also black and white. Like most of them were all, they were either color and hardcover, or they were black and white and soft cover. So new armor types, page 12. So like I said, if you wanted to just give your villains or NPCs something a little more interesting, then you could give them some like the armor suits from here, like Brigadine, which is sort of a throwback to like 2nd edition AD&D. I know had that quite a bit. Leather scale, bark armor, ringmail, dwarven stone armor. So just some really, really cool stuff in here. So absolutely love this book. Alright, up next we've got a bit of a selection of those misses that I was talking about. So these are books that had an interesting concept where, I was really looking forward to getting them, but after I got them and started reading them, it was just like, oh, these aren't very good. So the first one here is Savage Species. So this was a book dedicated to playing monster races. So with 3rd edition, they had what was called like equivalent levels. equivalent character levels, or ECL adjustments, for the more powerful, like, races that you could potentially play. Like, I think orcs, because they had like +4, I think, to strength. I want to say they had an ECL of +1. I think hobgoblins may have had them as well. So basically, if you couldn't play them at first level, but if they had an ECL of 1, like if the party was second level, you could play one, but it was a first level character. And the problem with this, and this is what was the big issue with this book, is that it broke down the progression of the monster into levels, so that you could play them at first level, which on paper sounds really, really good. But some of these things have ridiculously high ECLs versus the amount of hit dice that they actually get. So there are some creatures in here that have like the equivalent character level of like 16, but only have like half the hit dice, which makes them significantly weaker, and less able to take to take on the encounters that are thrown at them. So, like, for example, a Mind Flayer, I think, had an ECL of 16. And I'm not going to probably be able to find it in here, but... Oh, maybe I can. Just give me a second here. So I just want to make sure that I do have this correct. Okay, the Mind Flayer. Oh, sorry, it had an effective character level of 15th, but only had 8 hit dice. And the reason that this doesn't quite work is, if you think about it, like, a Mind Flayer is not a fair challenge for, like, it's going to get destroyed by a group of 15th level characters, and yet you're saying that your 15th level character, Mind Flayer, is supposed to be, like, on par with the rest of the party, and that's just really not the way that it works out, unfortunately. And you can't take anything else. You have to go through the entire progression before you can take like your first level of character class. So if you wanted to be like, say, a Mind Flayer wizard or Mind Flayer fighter even, you don't get your first class level until like 16th level. At that point, if you're not using the next book I'm going to show, then you're only going to get like 4 or 5 levels, and there are other ones that are like that as well. So unfortunately, it just didn't work as well as I think they had hoped it did, and it was one of those books that, again, a lot of people were looking forward to, and I don't think anyone actually ended up using it, that I know of anyway. I'm not saying that nobody ever used it, but nobody within my circle of friends actually thought the book was worth implementing, so that's a bit of a shame. Up next is that other book I was talking about, and this is the Epic Level Handbook. So this is the book for taking your characters beyond 20th level, and again, this was something that sounded really, really cool and interesting. The Forgotten Realms hardcover book, which predates this, had their own version of Epic, which was its own sort of subset of leveling. So you could be like, 20th level fighter, and then second, like, Epic level 2. And with the Forgotten Realms version, you could choose like another hit dice, I think, or you could choose another increase to your base attack bonus, and increase to your saving throws, or like increase to your like an extra feat or stuff like that. And it was actually an okay system. This one changed things quite a bit, and it just, in my opinion, just wasn't as good. There were a lot of feats in here that are kind of broken, and basically at epic level, you could just take them multiple times. Like, there's one that lets your Paladin Smite deal double damage, and each time you take the feat, it increases the damage, by another multiplier of 1. And it was good, and that's probably actually the least broken one in here, but there's just sort of things along those lines, and again, the big hallmark was that very few of them had the same restrictions that other feats had, where you could only take them once. So this one you could just stack things on. But the biggest problem with this book, there are 2 things. Number one is the epic level spell system, which you almost had to have a degree in theoretical physics to work out. You had like different spell seeds that you could combine together to create effects, and then you had to spend an amount of money equal to like multipliers based off of the seeds that you put in there. It was a bit of a mess, and just having like 10th level spells, I think, would have made things so much easier. rather than taking that route. But you know, it is what it is there. The other big problem is that there's this huge imbalance in the monsters in here. So you have a handful of monsters for like CR 21, 22, 23, I think up to like 25. And then there's this huge gap, and then you're fighting things that have like CR 40. There's a creature in here that basically there's no reason why it shouldn't be like the only divine being in the entire D&D world, because it's more powerful than the gods, basically. So it's just sort of weird that they have stuff like that. And then you had like epic level dragons, like the Force Dragon, who like the small wormling version, like the youngest, just coming out of like hatching out of the egg, was almost as powerful as the most powerful ancient red dragon. And again, it just didn't flow well. And again, it was another one of those books that I just don't think got a lot of use. And you know, 3.0 was also a bit of a mess anyway when it came to the rules. So the high level play was already pretty rough as it was, and this just made it even worse. So this is another one of those books that didn't really get a lot of use. I had one friend try to run one epic campaign once, starting everyone at 21st level, and I think that it only got a single session in before it just got completely scrapped. So unfortunately, balance back then was just not super great, but we got that one there as well. And then up next, I've got the Psionics Handbook. So this was another one of those books, unfortunately, and I feel bad because, again, you know, Bruce Cordell, one of my favorites. He was a contributor of the Epic Level Handbook as well, and this is just not that great. Psionics just weren't as good as traditional spellcasting in this version of the game, and they did fix it in 3.5, and I'll talk about that when that time comes. But one of the big issues with this is that the different, essentially like the schools or disciplines of psionic powers had different physical attributes that you would have to have in order to use them, because the DCs were based off of that particular stat. So you may have something that uses your dexterity to fuel the power. So your DC would be 10 plus your dex mod. And then you would have, you know, like for basically all 6 of the stats. And so the problem with that is that you didn't really have, you know, you weren't going to have all of your stats really good. So it limited the abilities that you could take if you actually wanted them to be reliable somewhat. Which again was a bit of a shame, because you could be a generalist wizard and, you know, take necromancy, divination, abjuration spells, evocations, and they would all be relatively well effective. But with the Psionics Handbook, unfortunately, it just didn't quite work out that way. And then you also had the issue of powers not scaling, and so your first level powers were always going to have the same damage values and everything else, and there was no way to change that. You would have to basically drop the older version and take a higher level version, and it just didn't work well, unfortunately. Again, it was just one of those things that was a cool concept, and they just didn't get it right the first time. All right, sorry for this taking, you know, kind of a long video, but I haven't really talked about these 3.0 books for a very, very long time. So and I probably will never get a chance to really talk about them again. So I apologize if I'm, you know, kind of discussing each of the books a little bit more than maybe I did in some of the earlier videos, but it's just been quite a while. So let's just move on though. So up next we have the Dee Dees and Demigods book. So another quick story about this one. This was a book that I really was looking forward to. I had picked up the Faiths and Pantheons for Forgotten Realms before I bought this, and like just the background and history of some of like the major gods was really, really well done, and I wanted to have that same level of information in for the Greyhawk gods, the ones that came with like the default setting for the 3rd edition system. Especially for you know, gods like Vecna, who is probably still to this day is probably my favorite not Forgotten Realms, my favorite Greyhawk deity. So I was really looking forward to, having his history and backstory, because Vecna, more than anybody else, has probably the most compelling backstory of the Greyhawk gods, and you don't get that in here. This is a whole bunch of different, like, mythology or mythos or whatever you want to call them. So you have the Greyhawk gods, but their descriptions are essentially the same thing as what you had in the player's handbook, with just a few extra gods thrown in there. So it was really disappointing from that perspective. But then you had, similar to the Deities and Demigods book from first edition, you had things like the Celtic mythos. You had the Asian, or not Asian, but I think like Japanese specifically or Chinese specifically, and then you had some other ones along those, like Greek, Roman. Norse, I think, was another one that was in here as well. So you had a whole bunch of gods to choose from, but it was mostly just their stats. And again, I'm not really looking to have the characters fight the gods anyway, so I wanted it more for backstory, and unfortunately I didn't get that in there. So that was a little bit disappointing, but again, it's still, a cool book to have. And there was an interesting monotheistic religion in here, represented in here as well. And that was actually pretty cool, I'd have to say, to have that in there. And that's the god there, Taya. Anyway, so that was probably the best part of the book, and probably one of the more fleshed out sections too, actually. All right, up next we have, again, one of my more recent additions to my 3rd edition library, along with the Psionics Handbook. This is Manual of the Planes, and this book is awesome. This is actually such a good book that sections from it were lifted and put into the 3.5 Dungeon Master's Guide just to fill out the page count, because they wanted to expand all of the core books to have the same number of pages. So this is just an absolutely fantastic book. It's full of prestige classes and spells and all kinds of like great information on the various planes of existence, which is really neat. You have like the cosmology, the wheel that they had. Just an overall just a really fantastic book, and one of the ones that I felt was missing from my collection for so long, because I wasn't interested in it at the time. When it first came out, I wasn't really into collecting D&D books until 3.5 or just before 3.5. And this was one of those books I was like, oh, well, that's kind of neat, but I don't see me using it at the time that it came out. And by the time I was interested in getting it, it was already out of print or very difficult to come by. So it just, like, the distributors in my area just didn't have it. So, like, the owner of my local game store couldn't even order it in, which was unfortunate, but I do have a copy of it now. And like I said, I absolutely love this book. All right, we're getting there. Only a few things left to go through, so let's just move these over here. All right, so up next we've got sort of an interesting case here. We have the Book of Vile Darkness. This is by Monty Cook. And Monty Cook's name is very well known in the tabletop RPG industry. He's the person who wrote the original Dungeon Master's Guide for 3rd edition 3.0. And then he also went on to do his own Arcana Unearthed role-playing rules through, like, Sword and Sorcery. He did the Ptolis campaign setting as well, and just a few other things. So he's, again, a very well-loved member of the gaming community. At least last I checked. I haven't really heard much from him in the last almost decade. I think was the last time I heard much about him. But again, really, really cool. So this book is interesting, but it does have a few issues with it. This was the first, like, mature rated book for 3rd edition. There was actually a sticker on there, like a parental advisory sticker. I took it off because I knew that if I didn't, it was just going to, if I took it off, pulled it off the shelf or put it back on more than just a few times, that sticker was going to start to rub off. It was going to start to look like crap, and I didn't want it on there. So I took it off. A buddy of mine left it on just because I think he knew how much it bothered me that it was there. But this book is, again, there's some pretty dark things in here. There's rules on, like, drug use and, like, willing deformities and just, things along those lines. But there are also some unusual decisions in some of the things that they had. Like one of the feats was morbid obesity, which what it did is it adjusted, like it lowered your dexterity. I want to say it took like 2 off your dexterity, but then it added 2 points to, actually let's see if I can find it here just while I'm, I think it's willing deformity, or I think, yeah, no, I think you had to have willing deformity first, so let's just see if we can find it here. Deformity obese, there we go. So yeah, so you get a +2 deformity bonus to your constitution and a -2 deformity bonus to dexterity, or penalty, not bonus. So -2 to dexterity. You also gain like a bonus to intimidate checks and stuff like that. So the reason that didn't really work too well is, like, the idea behind it was you lost agility, but you gained just, you were so like morbidly obese that you effectively were harder to strike in like vital organs because there was just so much like layers of fat, which makes sense. But the problem is that it also increased your fortitude saving throws to avoid like disease and poison and things like that, and it also gave you a bonus on endurance. So you could technically run, like do like forced marches, and you could sustain like high speed running longer than characters that didn't have it. It was actually bad enough that the feat was revised for 3.5, and you took a -2 penalty to Dex there, and then you ended up gaining an equivalent amount of hit points as if you had a Constitution score 2 higher. So you didn't get those other bonuses you didn't essentially become healthier because of how fat you were. So that was just one of those things that's like, I know the idea behind it, but it just didn't work out too well. The other thing I really wanted to show here right quick is one of the other major things that a lot of people remember this book from, and that would have to be the depiction of Demogorgon. So if you know the 5th edition depiction, or even the ones that came later in 3rd edition's lifespan, or even back in like the earlier days, the one thing that was always consistent about Demogorgon is that he had like 2 baboon heads, and that was like the major, one of his major defining characteristics. And he was sort of like he became in later years like really like wide-chested and muscular, and things like that. But he wasn't always necessarily like that in like 1st edition AD&D. But in 3rd edition, they made this really weird decision to make him a scrawny, 2-headed, like the 2 heads were both hyena heads instead of the baboon heads, and he's just like super skinny and just not intimidating looking at all. Like, this is not the type of creature that I think would strike like a ton of fear. It looks kind of goofy, and the hyena heads have just never been, like I said, if there was one thing that you had to get right about Demogorgon, it was the baboon heads, and they kind of messed that up, unfortunately. So, and I think it's a bit unfortunate as well, because I think that's one of the things that this book is most remembered for, and it's a bit of a shame because it is a really interesting book beyond that. And that said, the last thing I'll say about this book is that, back in the 80s and stuff, there was always like the anti-religious, or the religious groups that were anti-D&D, because they thought it was like an evil presence that was corrupting, the youth and opening the gate to devil worship. And having this book on your shelf, if like your parents, your concerned parents, if this was the first one that they pulled off the shelf, it might lend credence to that preconceived notion. So again, just sort of unfortunate there as well, but a cool book for most of the stuff that's in there. All right, up next we have just a couple of campaign setting things. The first one we have here is the Kingdoms of Kalamar. So I don't actually know a lot about this. This is one of those books that I've had for a few years and have always wanted to get to reading, but never did. This was actually developed by Kenzer and Company, and is officially licensed for Wizards of the Coast. So Kings of Kalamar, I believe, is the world for the Hackmaster role-playing game, which was by extension created as part of like the Knights of the Dinner Table comic series. So just really cool stuff in here. Some interesting artwork, and this was one of the first campaign settings to actually come out for 3rd edition, if I recall. I'm just trying to see the year that this was released in. So 2001 is when this particular version of it came out. So it is a pretty cool book. I've flipped through it, but I've never really spent a lot of time reading it. Just sort of, I guess, sort of a bit of a novelty, but I got this again for a good price. And I loved Knights of the Dinner Table, and to me it just made sense to get this campaign setting from the same people. And along those lines, I have one of the supplements for it as well. So this is the Kingdoms of Kalamar supplement of Stealth and Style. So it has like some variant classes for, I guess, classes that would have to be introduced in here. Never really read through this one either. I got these both together, and like I said, I got a pretty good deal on both of them. So just kind of cool to have that. Alright, and then we got our last couple of things here. So up first, there's just a little bit of stuff that was left on the table. So anyway, so up first we have the Dungeons and Dragons Gazetteer. So this came out for, again, pretty early on in the days of 3rd edition. This is it just basically sets gives you some information on the default campaign setting. Not a lot of information in here. It's only like 32 pages, I think. But it gave you a little bit of stuff to go off of on the actual the fact that Greyhawk was the default 3rd edition campaign setting. So really cool to have this information here. It does also come with a map of the world of Greyhawk, Oerth, or whatever you want to call it. So pretty cool to have that, but again, it's kind of lacking. However, I also have the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer. So Living Greyhawk was the organized play, similar to like D&D Adventurers League now. So this was done through the RPGA, the Role Playing Games Association, and you had like different regions, throughout like North America or even the world, would sort of be set in different regions of the world of Greyhawk or different areas of Oerth. And but this is the overall information for everyone, so it goes over the world itself, and this is basically a campaign setting. And for those who are looking for a little bit more information on some of the gods, this has a little bit more information. I feel it's a better representation of the deities from Greyhawk than the Dee Dees and Demigods book was. But it's really cool to have this as well. This also came with a map that I do not have, but I do have the one that came in the Gazetteer, and I don't think they were drastically different. Maybe just differences in color, maybe, was the only thing. So, I have my Greyhawk map, which is really cool. So anyway, that was my 3rd edition D&D collection, my 3.0 collection, and I just want to thank you guys for watching the video. Let me know what your experiences with 3.0 were, if you had them. Were there any books that you've seen here that you maybe have some interesting memories about or stories about? I'd love to hear those. And I just want to thank you guys for allowing me to take this sort of trip down memory lane, because it's been over a decade since I talked about most of these books, and it'll probably be a long time before I get the chance to do so again. So anyway, again, thank you guys very much for watching. I really appreciate it and all the support, and I will see you next time. Take care.